Emilio, thanks for singing up today.
Hey Ken, how's it going?
I want to do just a little bit of a look back before we do a look forward, and some of the cool things that we're working together on. Um, but I actually saw this and I wanted to be specific about it. So I could see like iTunes receipts from you for, I think it was Discourse. Was that your, or Discord? What was, whatever the dictionary app you had, right, in
It was called
2011?
Discourse. Yeah,
Yeah, Discourse. I knew it was something with the D. But I think I was buying Jailbreak tweaks from you in 2010. Like, I don't know exactly when you started doing your Jailbreak tweaks, but I'm pretty sure I bought things from you before that. And then Daniel, who is your designer counterpart, I think worked on with you with both the like iOS app in the store as well as with your Jailbreak tweaks. Um, and I was trying to exactly get this right. I believe I started going to WWDC in 2010, but I think I met you at 2011 at a meetup, right? Like after maybe the first day of the keynote. And I knew who you were. I don't know if, I think we followed each other on Twitter. Twitter was like a bigger thing back then, like getting to know people in the iOS community that there wasn't a lot of us right back then. And we didn't even call it iOS back then. It was, iPhone. It was eventually iPhone OS. Um, but I knew you because I'd use your notifications tweak, I believe is the main one that I knew you for. Like I always give people, when I introduce you, I always talk about like, hey, Emilio wrote notifications before Apple did, right? Which I think is true. And you never correct me, so I'm gonna keep running with that. But you were actually one of the first people that saw a live demo of Agenda, which was, the calendar app that I had done back then, and went on to be one of the most popular, third-party calendar apps for a couple of, 2 or 3 years, maybe a little bit more than that. And then that space got very, very crowded. But we did swipe gestures and all these things, and you were like, "Oh, this is really neat." And I think you gave me some good feedback, and that was a fun time. But right, these are like days when there weren't a lot of things out there, like Agenda, like the things that you were doing. And needless to say, a lot's happened in 10 years, right? So if it was 2011 that we met, probably around the summertime or so. Um, and then I think you were finishing out school and you kind of did a couple different things. You got into game design a little bit, which has helped you with some of the work we've done at Savvy. But a lot has changed in 10 years. So I actually kind of want to start there a little bit, because I kind of feel that a lot of people who did Jailbreak, were part of that Jailbreak community, didn't ever really make the transition. So I wanted to start with like, how did you even get involved in the Jailbreak community? Because that is something that I'm still, we really never talked about that. I just was like, okay, Emilio was an awesome Jailbreak developer, but how did you figure that whole ecosystem out? And it seemed like you did pretty well with it for a while. So let's start back there.
sure. Well, I joined the Jailbreak community by necessity almost because back then there was no Apple Store, no App Store where you could like publish your apps. So
Sure.
all we had was the Jailbreak community, and I had this iPod Touch. The very like right now it's very small. I still have it. Like it's tiny,
Mm-hmm.
and I was I started by doing themes. I just wanted to like modify the way it looked.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I started like modifying some PNG files, replacing them, packaging them up, and then I moved into trying to write some extensions on my on the extensions. Sorry, some extensions of the twigs that I was using,
Mm-hmm.
and that's how I started with code.
Yep.
And that's how I got into Jailbreak community because I needed to. And
Yep.
then when I did iClassic, which was my first app,
Mm-hmm.
I think I released it in December 2009.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
a while back, and
Yep.
I knew it was not going to be approved into the Apple Store, until the App Store. So
Sure.
that's why I had to go through Cydia, because I
Yep.
knew Apple was going to reject it. And the next app I made was Notified, which is the one you mentioned about
Sure.
having um, notifications before Apple made them. And in 2011, which is where we met at WWDC,
Mm-hmm.
is where I got Sherlocked by Apple when they introduced um, their own notification system.
Yep.
And so that's coming up. It's going to coming up 10 years since that.
You've got that one marked on the calendar as well. It's meeting
Yes.
Ken and working with Ken, and also when Apple locked you out. And correct me if I'm wrong again, that there is some value here in talking about the history of the ecosystem that is so prevalent today, right? That like everyone uses, generally speaking, either iOS or Android. I think they actually had a developer who also was part of the Jailbreak community go over to Apple. And I believe that person also helped a lot with like building out the notifications. Yeah, I think he was almost like an intern, but he basically built another, he also built like a whole notification system. So I don't recall his name, but that was something that kind of caught my eye back then because, he went to work and we would say like you got, subsumed back into the mothership. But and just for people to know this, like the iClassic was essentially making your iPod to look more like the original iTunes. Was that what that one was? I forget.
It was a little iPod simulator. So it
Okay.
had a little click wheel and you can like
Yeah.
scroll
Yeah. Yeah.
around,
Sure.
tap, and it was basically like a media player skin.
Sure. So, I've alluded to this a moment ago when I asked the question directly. Again, some of the tweaks, and I know you were saying kind of like extensions and tweaks, and people don't know all the jailbreak jargon, and we don't have to get into all that now. But there were whole different categories, right? And I just never really saw a lot of those guys make the switch. And again, I don't know what the jailbreak community is doing now. Frankly, over time, it just didn't seem like it was thriving as it was sort of a cat and mouse game between Apple patching things all the time. But you were able to make that transition, and you've made your living, on the App Store, and not in the sense of being an independent developer, but you've definitely done independent, things through the years. But as a lead developer, previously with me at Savvy and now at Modus, and you're doing awesome things here. And we'll get into a little bit of that stuff as we talk later. But how did you make the jump? How did you successfully go from this jailbreak person to being someone that actually was part of the real ecosystem? Because it seemed to be difficult for a lot of folks.
Yeah, I also don't know what happened to the jailbreak community. I think part of it is that the community grew so big that they kind of like blended into everybody else. So it's kind of hard to keep track of everybody. Sure. I think for me, the turning point was when Apple started adding everything I wanted out of the jailbreak into the system. So start with notifications, but they started adding like right now we have widgets, we have control center, all of that stuff it used to be a jailbreak tweak. And so once they added all of that, backgrounding for apps, it started making less sense to me to keep jailbreaking. And like you said, it's a game of cat and mouse, and Apple keeps cracking down on the jailbreak, and you have to wait a few months, be on a previous release to be able to jailbreak.
Sure.
So it was just not worth it anymore. And I still enjoy making experiences. So that's why I switched to.
Sure. Well, and so I want to talk about a thing you mentioned there in depth a little bit, because there was this, what I kind of thought about at the jailbreak community as this sort of proving ground for the core iOS. So let's get to that in a minute. But, were there technical challenges in going from jailbreak to, using what was again called the iPhone SDK back then? So totally understand why from a sort of a business standpoint that you moved over, but were there technical things that you had to learn? Because when I worked with a couple of other jailbreak folks, they just seem to kind of do things in a very different way than like you should be doing on iOS, right? So are there any sort of like technical challenges? Is it completely different? It's like, hey, you're just learning a whole different way of doing things. Was there any similarities between the two, or are they completely different?
It's definitely quite a bit different because it's way less hacky. Like when we're doing the jailbreak stuff, we were looking into decompiled headers to see how things were working. It was a lot of digging around, and now you just go into the docs and find out how to do things. So I think like maybe the reason some of these people didn't make the jump is because they were more like had a more hacker spirit than I did. I always enjoyed making experiences, and iClassic, the iPod simulator that I made, it's not a tweak. It's an app that I just distributed outside of the App Store, and that was my first step.
Okay.
And
awesome.
even Notified, it started as an app. Before I added the dropdown, all the notifications went into an app on like an icon on its own.
Yeah. No, I remember that. Yep. Yeah, and you guys, and again, who knows what Daniel's doing these days, but he was a really talented designer as well. That being the case, one of the reasons why I've appreciated working with you through the years, and aside from the quality code, is you just have a great sense of design. I mean, if anyone's watching this on YouTube, they could see how dapper you are. We call it the Emilio Smolder. Got to at least work that in one time. No, but you really care about, right? Like you keep talking about experiences, not just writing code. And so how things look and feel, I give, again, we did a project recently where like you almost had everything perfectly to design spec without a designer being involved during the prototype phase, right? Just by using like the client's, design guidelines. And it's like, oh yeah, well, we actually really don't need to do any more design here. Emilio pretty much did it by just absorbing that. So I love that you talk about experiences versus just writing code. And going back to that point I was saying is that I used to often comment that I felt like the Jailbreak community basically helped inform the iOS roadmap through the years, right? And that happens maybe earlier on in an ecosystem's lifecycle, right? They sort of have these like fringe, either hackers or they have sort of these fringe communities that become actually like that proving ground, right? And all those things, as you mentioned, like I stopped eventually jailbreaking as well, not developing jailbreaks, but stopped jailbreaking because I kept getting at every new WWDC or every release of iOS the things that I wanted that were there. And some of the things are like really basic, like we didn't have folders, right, for a long time, and folders were something that you could get from Cydia, which was like the main jailbreak store. Or like replying to a message, right? You couldn't do that necessarily before, and you could have a jailbreak tweak to like reply to a message without having to like go into the message. Backgrounding was a major one. But even something, this was actually one of my favorite ones, and Apple only just recently finally got this one out there, is like being able to have the call banner, right, to decline a call while the phone's open. Like that was one of my favorite tweaks of all time, because I would always get interrupted doing something. Now you just get that little banner, and that was again something that was built by the community. So I don't want to belabor that. Some people might be like, oh great, who cares about this stuff? Well, it's historical context, right, for like what you're using today on iOS. So I wanted to talk about that a little bit, but I do want to start thinking about just the Apple ecosystem in general. You've focused specifically there. You haven't touched Android. You probably could figure it out if you wanted to, right? But you stayed in Xcode and kind of looked at this thing through the years. And I want to talk about sort of how WWDC in particular, which is again where we met. Like we could have kept just being Twitter friends, but we met in person there. How has that influenced you and impacted you over the years? And maybe it's a little bit different now than it used to be, but in those, let's say, the glory days of the App Store, how did that help you become who you are today as a lead iOS developer?
Yeah, WWDC is like our Christmas, like developers' Christmas, just because we get all these goodies in the form of frameworks that we can use. And last year we got widgets, which is a massive one that everybody flocked into. We've also had some flops, like I was thinking like iMessage apps that didn't really take off. But it's always what we like, the time of the year when we had to experiment with all these things. And we also get access to the beta, which is really interesting, because I often have the beta for a few months before it comes public, and I show stuff to other friends and they're like, oh, how do you get that? And it's kind of nice to be like, oh, it's because I'm a programmer. So it definitely, kind of renews that interest. And what you said about me not going into Android is like my way of being passionate about this is building stuff that I can see on my phone. And that's how I started. I wanted to put stuff on my iPod Touch. And that's what kept me going. So I don't have an Android phone. I've been an Apple fan. Partly because what you mentioned about the design, like Apple has the very tight design guidelines, or very solid design guidelines that are easy to build on. And I've always enjoyed working with designers. You mentioned Daniel, but I also work with another designer for Discourse called Matthew, with Christian for iClassic. So it was so easy to find designers, because it was a small community and everybody wanted to build stuff. And it's with the
no, please go ahead.
With a small amount of like apps coming out, it was also pretty easy to make money, because like if you put an app out there and it was decent and it looked good, people would be interested in it without any marketing, without any too much work.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I mean, again, it's worth pointing out for those that are listening, back then, like we didn't have Dribbble, right, to like go find designers. Designers were, very tightly, there were other places, right, that were like Dribbble, but not a Dribbble. So the designers and the developers in some ways were like hanging out in the same spaces, right? And kind of getting to know each other and doing projects like you talked about. Again, from Dominic, who was from around last week, he talked about like he was, a guy from Eastern Europe and, was building things before there was like Slack and, using like IRC and just like, finding people around the world that wanted to build cool things. And in some ways, that's the way the initial app ecosystem for Apple was built. You mentioned design as well. Eventually, I think Google really started embracing a lot of that with material design and has made a push on design. But you can kind of say to some extent that Apple led that design, first experience through the years. And so when we look at this stuff and we say, you wrote Objective-C initially, and now obviously it's Swift, or maybe not obviously, but Objective-C was the thing that you did for a while. I always kind of felt that was a approach that maybe was like a little bit more inaccessible to developers. Not like every developer just wasn't an Objective-C developer, right? That, like today, a lot of JavaScript developers started becoming Swift developers, and all of a sudden there was like a lot more people that were saying, hey, I'm going to go write applications. What made that language, hard or a challenge? Or if I'm off base, tell me. But, it seemed like there just wasn't as many developers back then before Apple released Swift.
I think you're right. And one of the reasons is a bit superficial, and is that it uses square brackets a lot. And then people see that and they're like be thrown off. They're like, what is this thing that I've never seen? And I think that's one of the reasons, because it's a C style language that doesn't really follow C syntax. So I think that's mainly the reason. Also, the other reason is that it was mostly used for Apple platforms, which are not as widely like Mac doesn't have as many users as Windows.
Sure.
And before iPhone came out, like there was no iPhone, so like there were like few use cases for that. So that's why the community was smaller. And I remember the first WWDC I attended, I think the tickets were on for like a week maybe. And 2 years or 3 years later, you had to like sign up.
Oh man, forget
within 10 seconds or something, or you wouldn't get it. And the next year they started doing the raffle where you sign up and it's a lottery, right? You may get to go, or so it grew really, really fast. And I think, like you said, Swift has only helped with that, because it looks more like other languages. It looks like Kotlin, it looks like JavaScript a bit. So it's more accessible for sure.
Sure. So it's not necessarily that if Apple stuck with Objective-C that, there wouldn't still be more Objective-C developers, but also moving to Swift probably open that up further. But to your point, initially, okay, you could build some Mac Mac-based applications, there was no Mac App Store at that point. Right. There was just sort of different places that you could distribute them, or just distribute them off your website. But the growth of just the number of iOS devices, right, and then eventually iPad and all these things, like, is what really helped make this and start even pulling more people into Objective-C. But when Swift was announced, and this was around 2014 or so, it was a major thing, right? I don't think really anyone had any clue that was going to happen. It was kind of crazy, right? To some extent, I was like, what just happened here? This was, a major thing. What was your initial reactions to it, when you first saw that back in 2014?
It was definitely a big shock when that happened. We, like you said, we had no idea that was coming. I think Apple does sometimes too well at secrecy. So we had no idea. We had no preparation for that. And I think my first reaction was a bit of rejection. Like, I already know this. I'm very proficient at this. Why are they trying to like do a 180 on me, And also, that also compounded with the fact that the first version was not great. It was missing a lot of work. So getting into that was tricky. Like, I did try to pick it up. I tried out, and I found a lot of roadblocks. I found a lot of things missing. And that started changing with Swift 2, which was like a huge leap. And then Swift 3 was another huge leap. And I think I started doing mostly Swift since Swift 2. But it was definitely shock and a bit of, like they pulled the rug out of under you. And
Yeah,
it's you're like left like, wait, what do I do?
sure. Yeah, I think there was, I don't want to say it was anger necessarily, but it was definitely like, what am I going to do going forward? I have to kind of relearn my career to some
Yeah.
extent. But that being the case, as you alluded to, we decided back when we were at Savvy not to adopt Swift until at least 2.0 was out. And we heard some pretty bad horror stories of people that like went all in on Swift with 1.0 and then basically had to rewrite the entire application. And these aren't small code bases, right? When 2.0 came out. And so, we kind of held off on doing that. I think we maybe added some, some bridging code in some certain cases for when it was 1.0, but then really 2.0 is when we said, hey, we feel comfortable to write a whole application in Swift. But now, you pride yourself in being as Swifty as possible, right? That's something I've heard from you through the years. Now it's kind of maybe a little bit old hat, but, as you were seeing Swift grow, that was a goal that you had for yourself. What advantages, if any, are there for those who initially wrote Objective-C code for today, or is it really at this point like not really that important?
I think at the beginning was just experience with frameworks, because the frameworks didn't change, it was only the language. So being able to read Objective-C and Swift meant that if you went to any websites like Stack Overflow, if you read any kind of example code, you
Mm-hmm.
can understand it. And I think
Sure.
that's still true, because there's still a lot of documentation that's still Objective-C.
Sure.
Right now, it's more common that you're going to go into Stack Overflow and see people who translate the answers to Swift as well.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't need it as much. But yeah, I think at the beginning, it was really important to be able to do both. If you had started programming with Swift on Swift 1 and didn't know Objective-C, you would have a hard time, because everything you looked for, or like, how do I do this? You would
Yep.
find Objective-C examples that
Sure.
if you didn't understand it at all, it would be a problem to.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I know there's always a little bit of this, again, we're not necessarily the old guys in terms of like just life itself, but we are the old guys in terms of like this platform and this ecosystem. That there's also people that are just coming out, or that grew up kind of on Swift and obviously are super talented. So we're not necessarily saying, okay, we're superior because we used to do things previously, but there is, again, some benefit for seeing lots of different things through the years, having worked with certain frameworks that initially you could only work with in the Objective-C. And now today, obviously, is available in Swift. And there's obviously new things that come out that weren't available previously when Objective-C was around. So as we kind of look through the last number of years, so again, if that's like, let's say 2014 to 2016 or so, all these kinds of things that are happening with Swift, and you've talked a lot about different technologies and some things that have come out that haven't been as successful. To this day, like I very rarely use an iMessage app, right? I think the ones that I use are sort of like dropping in a sticker or putting in a GIF, or those kinds of things are about the extent of what I use. And it's not because I'm knocking them. Like I wish there was more adoption, but it's hard to discover, right? And it's to some extent something that probably isn't going to be solved. They've tried a couple cuts at it. But if you look at the kinds of things that you've been a lead developer on, you've helped us as a lead developer, as a sort of a trusted person on the team, for household names, high profile startups, even, we've seen, you can go download some of our stuff and some of it, previously on the Savvy site. And now as we're at Modus, kind of getting some of those things out for Modus. But you could go, buy things using the apps that we built, right? You can kind of run your life to some extent with some of the apps that we've built. And we used to say that we want to make life better for people one app at a time. And, again, they could be across the life cycle. Like, we got to see something last year that was like one of the top apps on the entire app store, right? In the free category. Think about a little bit of those experiences and what lessons, you've learned, and, maybe sharing this with like other people that want to create high profile consumer apps. Like what are some things that you almost wish you knew, right? For the last 5 years doing those kinds of like, sometimes it's scary projects, right? Like, oh my gosh, like this is going to be in front of, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people. Probably we don't try to think about that every day, or we'd be almost like paralyzed. But, what are some things that you take away as lessons learned?
I think one of the biggest ones is testing, and it's not, I don't think it comes as a shocker, but things that you may like overlook or you don't realize because you're testing with like 5 people. Once
Mhm.
you deliver to thousands or millions, like even that 0.01% becomes significant.
Mhm. Yep.
So having a way to detect that and like get ahead of it, I think
Sure.
it's one of the big ones. The other one is like you said earlier, like I'm really into like designing and working with designers, and I really care about all the little things, and I think those make an app shine.
Mhm.
Because right now with the amount of developers there are, you can get a lot like an app done um, in multiple ways by a lot
Sure.
of people. And to me, like something when I see a new app, when it has like those cute little animations, those transitions,
Mhm.
those details, I think that are what set them apart with
Yep.
from other apps. Um,
Yep. Yeah, absolutely, man. I mean, the number of times you download an app, and frankly, I think maybe for a lot of people, and I think this is something that Apple struggles with, is like unless you hear, "Hey, you should go download this app" from someone, like people don't necessarily go look for new apps like we used to. I used to like literally every day look at
yeah,
the App Store, what's new, what's trending. We do this for a living, and I still look at it, but it's just not the same necessarily. It's those pieces that you just pointed out that would drive that kind of thing, like, oh, this is really fun, or this is different, or this is exciting. And in terms of your point on testing, one of the reasons why I was excited about the opportunity to join Modus here, and obviously when we talked to you and other team members about coming over, was our ability to have an entire practice kind of people or center of excellence around testing, right? And I think you probably are enjoying that on some of the projects you're on now, is like QA automation testing, and just sort of the discipline, and sort of the same way that you think about developing, in the same way that we've had people think about UX or design or product management and project management. We have that group of folks here who help, and we are helping educate them a little bit, frankly, on the native ecosystem, right? And there's just different tooling involved, but having that same approach to having great testing is something that I've appreciated, and I think other people have appreciated that as well. So let's think about really the last 6 months in particular. Again, we kind of, that's about the amount of time that or so that we joined here. And we've gotten to bring over some of our past clients, and we have some new clients that were sort of relationships from what we did before. But there's some newer iOS tech that we're getting to do, which is a little bit unique, especially for the high profile names that we're working with. And we're purposely being ambiguous as usual, because we have these little things called MSAs and confidentiality clauses. And I always joke around that I already signed away at least one or two of my children, and I don't want anyone coming after the rest of them. But sometimes large companies have an aversion to adopting new tech for obvious reasons. In fact, one of my partners, and obviously Jay Garcia here, we talked about this on an episode recently, focusing on like, when should a company adopt something that's new? Talk about how it's been for you specifically building widgets and app clips in particular, because again, typically something comes out at WWDC, you're not often like focusing on that, right? For in a production sense for years sometimes. We're doing it now, right? We're doing it for, like we said, I think, again, not disclosing the names of the customer, but there was like, they didn't even advertise one of the widgets we built, and it's like tens of thousands of downloads, right? And then eventually when they said that it's available, that's a whole nother ball game. But like literally that's the kind of, in a beta run, how many folks are using the thing. So how's that been for you, and working with some of this newer tech, and some of the rough spots and some of the fun parts of that?
yeah, we usually wait at least a couple of years just to give everybody time to update their iPhones, update their devices. Because if you try to move too fast, then you have to like either do a lot of work to make sure your app still works on the previous systems,
Mm-hmm.
or you have to drop it, and then you lose customers. And if you're a big company who has a lot of people with different devices, you probably don't want to drop iPhone 6 support or iPad 2 support.
Sure.
So I think something special with widgets and app clips is that they are like, you're not bound by that restriction. You can
Mm,
just adopt them, and people who have an iPhone with iOS 14 can install it, and
yep.
people who don't are not really affected, and you don't have to do a lot of more work.
Mm,
So I think that's really cool. And it also, there was like this like almost gold rush with widgets where people love them, and
Hmm.
just rushed into the app store to look for widgets. And that's why
Yep.
so many of these apps like show a photo in your widgets, or customize your widget, became
Yep.
very popular because people were searching for that.
Sure.
And I think that's also what helped convince these bigger companies to adopt widgets, because
Yep.
it was very easy to show, hey, people are looking for this,
Yeah,
so
that's fair.
we should get ahead and get ahead of the competition and have this for.
Sure. Yeah, and I mean, it's worth pointing out again. I know you're focused on iOS, but Android's had widgets for years, and for whatever reason, I'm not saying they haven't been popular, but they always felt very techy on Android, and it didn't feel like a lot of people. It didn't feel like it ever kind of reached the masses, the way that it did almost immediately on iOS. Again, I think Google's come a long way with how they think about design, but maybe part of that is just that experiential aspect that we're talking about, and how they approach building widgets. Again, obviously some lessons learned from other ecosystems that approach widgets. Apple also, obviously, we don't want to say like they never had widgets. They sort of had a different approach to that on the Mac, and then they've kind of taken the iOS approach now and brought it back to the Mac, right, in terms of like, okay, you could have these widgets again, just not like they were before. So I do want to talk about, though, the other side of this, which is the app clips, because I think probably less people have familiarity with that. And so maybe you could just start by talking about what that is, and then we'll talk maybe about some of the nuances and the kind of the lessons learned that we have from app clips, which, even though we're smart guys and we've looked at the documents, like until you start getting in there and trying to build this stuff, you don't necessarily, realize some of the gotchas, so to speak.
Right. So an app clip, just to get out there, app clips are a small, basically like a tiny version of your app that people can use without installing it. They don't have to go into the app store, search for your app and install it. They can go into your website or receive a message on iMessage, or scan a QR code, and the system downloads this small app that's called the app clip, and it runs it. And after 30 days, I believe, it's removed from your system.
Mm-hmm.
And something that's interesting there is that you also have push notification permissions for like 8 hours with an app clip.
Nice.
If you install it. So yeah, so like the developers can also message the user if needed. And
Yep.
yeah, that's it's a really interesting feature because it allows us to create like this marketing, like small samples of
Mm-hmm.
your app, so the user, you can drag users into like can show them what you have, what you can do, and
Yep.
entice them to download your full app.
Could you just for fleshing it out for folks a little bit, like talk about how you might encounter an app clip, again, without kind of disclosing stuff from our specific clients, but Apple provides a bunch of examples on this, but just so that people kind of more tangibly understand how this thing functions, because it's really important relative to the business case behind app clips.
Yeah, you can find them. I think the easiest one would be on a website. You go to a website and see a banner at the top that says, try this app or something like that. I don't know exactly
Mm-hmm.
what it says, but you can
Sure.
just tap and install it. And if you don't have an iOS 14 device, you have an iOS 13, you can also set that to just like open the App Store and install the app.
Sure.
But on iOS 14, that's how you find it. The other option is with QR codes, like Apple's own QR codes. You can scan
Mm-hmm.
it either with a camera. It can also be NFC enabled, so you can just put your phone close to it,
Yep.
and it downloads the app clip, and
Sure.
that's how you find them mostly.
And so, just to make it tangible, and again, this is not a client, but I think this is actually maybe even something that's focused on Apple's website. But let's say you're just at a place like Panera or some kind of grab and go place, and you don't have the Panera app, you might be able to like scan that code you talked about without having to wait for like this massive binary to install and kind of do all the things. It just would give you core parts of the functionality from the Panera app right there, right? And it, like you said, it kind of lives on your device for some period of time and then kind of goes away. And so this is really important, not just for speed, right? But obviously that, but like just getting people introduced to like why you would want to use this app. As we mentioned before, the difference today versus previous days is that like discovery is really a big challenge for new apps, or for apps not that are new but new to you. And so the goal with the app clip ultimately is to say, hey, person, try us out here, give us a little, here's a little taste, and find the value of this app, and then eventually go install it and use it as one of your sort of app, 100 plus apps or whatever that you might have on your device. So you mentioned one kind of nuance there, which is like the push notification stuff, right? Okay, you get access for 8 hours, which is actually really powerful because now, again, you can start interacting. I don't want to say marketing because that's like you have the negative connotation with that, but you can start interacting and trying to provide value and communicating with your customers, your users. But there's also a couple other things I think we've learned through the app clips. And I'm just curious, I think I can mention some of them, but I wanted to see what other things that you recall for things that we didn't know about, like, for example, the size of the app clip, like what you can actually do with the app clips, what you can't do, those kinds of things.
Yeah, so the main restriction you have with an app clip is the size is only limited to 10 megabytes, which is not a lot. Sometimes you'll download a library or framework that's 10 megabytes on its own. It might be like 80 megabytes on its own.
Sure.
So it definitely restricts you to what you can add, but it also makes you think harder about what you want to provide. And you can also, for example, you have like a big framework, you can like defer that to a server and do the processing of the device and bring it back. So that's one of the biggest challenges. You have to be more careful with what you put in there. But other than that, they are basically a full-fledged application. They have their own, you program them in a very similar way as you would a normal application. You have the whole life cycle. There's a few restrictions. I believe, I don't know exactly which ones they are, but you cannot access all of it. I don't think you can access, for example, the camera, or maybe you can, but there are some restrictions about what systems you can access in the device. But they're surprisingly like few. It's a very powerful thing.
And the way that we've kind of educated our clients is like, okay, and just to be clear, you can only have one app clip, right? You can't have multiple app clips. So the way that we're kind of educating folks, which is the other restriction besides the size, having one is, thinking about even things like deep linking to some extent, like how do you come into the app clip and then kind of tailoring the experience based on that, right? Again, you can't add 100 experiences because it's a 10 megabyte, file size. But you can think about, okay, if I came in through this traffic source or through this deep link or this attribution channel, we can kind of tailor the experience or tailor what piece of thing that the user or the client's going to do in that case, or the customer is going to do in that case. Is that fair?
Yeah, you can choose which kind of entry point you can define various entry points. So, for example, like you said, you're waiting in line in a fast food restaurant. You scan the QR code there, and it takes you to the pickup, like purchase and pickup section of the app clip, right? Or maybe you are at a bus stop, and you see this ad for that same restaurant, and you scan it, and it takes you to the restaurant finder. And in that case, for example, you could also have a special identifier that says, oh, this person is at this bus stop, so preload the app clip with the restaurants that are nearby. And same with the pickup. You can preload it in a way that the app clip right away knows which restaurant you're in based on the parameters that you pass on the QR code.
Yep, good stuff. So I want to kind of wrap up with a couple different thoughts here. Want to definitely get your take on the future of iOS, but before we get there, just kind of a consideration as it relates to new technology, as it relates to the size and the scope of the projects that we take on. When you get put onto these projects and they have these like massive code bases that have been written, arguably over 10 plus years, right? Of course, they have gone through rewrites, but they're really large code bases. How do you approach solving for all that knowledge, right? How do you kind of approach like digesting that, distilling that? As an example, one of the, a number of the widgets that you help lead for some recent engagements also consume data out of the app itself, not, through the APIs, but like sort of the data that was accessible in the app. What's the approach, the thinking on how to go about that process in a smart, kind of, I don't want to say like procedural way, but not just a haphazard way of like starting to understand code bases. I think that's real important for people when they think about these things, in order to get this new kind of technology moving.
Yeah, I think the easiest way is usually find what's already in the device, what's already stored when a user logs in. The app stores some data. So try to find what that happens in the code base and hook that into either hook that into the widget code or replicate it.
Hmm.
Like you said, sometimes the code bases are massive. Sometimes they have a lot of like technical debt as well,
Sure.
and it's just navigate them. It's an effort. So
Yep.
finding the existing features. Maybe you go into the login page, you log in, and then try to find out which function is called that saves the data into the device, and then you hook into that.
Sure.
And
And
sometimes it's easier to just write it from scratch. Like
sure.
widgets and app clips have to be small. So if the existing app code requires a library that's 20 megabytes, or just requires a lot of classes to be also imported to it,
Yep.
maybe it might be better to just write it from scratch and have like a little smaller version of it.
Sure. And I was going to say that obviously, excuse me, to some extent, it's based on like how good the code base is documented, you know, what resources that we might have, or let's say if someone's doing this internally, working with another team that owns different parts and sections of the app. But this is the benefit to some extent, right, of us being able to kind of drop in and do something discrete, right? And there are other cases where, again, not necessarily projects that you're on, but where we are owning entire parts of the app, or we're building the whole thing, right? We're building the whole platform. But this is a little bit of a more unique challenge because we have to tightly align and couple with our client and, kind of bring this new tech. And it's really, again, not about like consultancy, because this can happen, if you're a developer at Panera, right? Like same thing, like you might just say, oh, someone might task you and say, you have to go build these new widgets or these new app clips, and you still have to approach those problems with some of the things that we're sharing here. So I wanted to talk just at the end here about iOS 15. It's probably way too early to sort of say what's going to go in there. And I never really like to try to say, here's what's going to come out in iOS 15. Sometimes we've been able to guess, right? But are there any other kind of wish list things for you, whether it's from a consumer side, like as a user of iOS, or things from a developer side that you hope that Apple will release as this year goes on? And, WWDC will be in another month or so, just a little bit more than a month, and it'll be virtual again, I believe. But what are some things that you're hoping to see come out of that this year?
I think as a user, my biggest one is to have better widget support on my iPad, just because I feel like I would have a very nice dashboard. Right now, you're limited to like a column on the left of the main screen, but I just want a full screen with widgets so I can just have it there and take a glance at like what I would call a dashboard. And as a developer, there are some really interesting things coming for Swift. They just released 14.5, which has the new Swift. I think it's Swift 5.4. So they're always building on that. And I think the next big one is going to be async await, which is something that I feel like they still owe us since it's been on JavaScript for a while. So I think that kind of stuff that just allows us to write code faster, with less errors. Like you said, I also don't like to speculate or go too much into rumors, because it's just a great way to be disappointed. But yeah, like just continue building those tools we had. Like I think sync await is one of the biggest ones that I can think of the top of my head. But
well, I think you and I probably both knew Mark Gurman, who used to like break every single Apple and iOS story as like a teenager, or like literally probably was a teenager. And now I'm pretty sure he's at Bloomberg. He's always getting inside information from lots of different sources at Apple. And I'm pretty sure, to your point on the sort of end user side, that Apple's going to double down on sort of the widget, experience, and possibly even allow you to further maneuver and manipulate the home screen, which is something that, even though they added widgets, like the home screens pretty much remained almost the same since day one, with the exception of obviously folders. But I guess supposedly allowing you to have things like just entire screens full of widgets and, nothing else, and maybe just having more control over how those widgets are laid out. So that'll definitely be interesting. And it's kind of cool that, again, we're on the front lines. And I didn't get to hit on your point earlier when you said, it was the popularity of widgets that is really driving some of this new tech to be adopted, but it was super crazy, right? And it sort of went mainstream because of some, Instagram influencers saying like, oh, look what you could do with some of these widgets. So it's been a cool ride to see all that stuff, and then being able to see consumer trends, which often will influence things that happen in business, but often it will take longer than it did this year. But it's just like that craze, and that was the kind of driving it all. So I think that's it. I like to just always give you an opportunity, to mention like where we can find you online. I think you are more of a Twitter and kind of a Medium guy than a LinkedIn guy, but give us like where can we find you online, so that we can link that up for folks.
Right. I do have LinkedIn, but I don't open it too often. I do hang out on Twitter a lot. I don't tweet a lot, but I do follow some people, and I like reading what they say. My Twitter is
Sure.
at Emilio Peláez,
Yep.
Pelaez. And I think that's my main
Cool.
hanging spot.
Yeah, and I know that you've. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm also I have a few apps on the App Store that are free with widgets. If anybody wants to give it a go with some widgets.
Cool. Yeah, we'll link those up for folks because again, unfortunately, we can't necessarily share out all the ones for our clients, but definitely want you to see Emilio's handiwork there. And obviously, we're doing cool things here with widgets, app clips. So if anyone needs help, again, not selling us here, just like I'm happy to talk with people and give tips and lessons learned on the widget stuff. So definitely feel free to reach out, Ken at moduscreate.com, or hit me up on LinkedIn. So I think that's it for this week, man. I hope I didn't go too deep into the historical pieces of it all, but I think that provided some context for folks. So I know you've got just a couple things to do, Emilio. So I'm going to let you get back to it here, and we'll catch everybody on the flip side.
Cool. Thank you, Ken.